Welcome back. I hope you're all well. We've got another security stories for you. This time I'm going to be talking about sex. The general consensus with guys that work in security, especially in the pub and club scene, is that they are a bunch of degenerates, let's be honest. And I've got to say there's quite a bit of truth to that. So I'm going to go through some of the experiences that I witnessed, some of the stuff I saw. Hopefully this will allow people to make better judgments. You know, if you're a young lady watching this, although there are very few, then it might warn you about some red flags if you're thinking of hooking up with a guy in security, especially in the pub and club scene, or just guys in general. And secondly, you know, if you're a guy that's getting into security, it might actually give you an idea of how not to behave, because this kind of stuff, when I was doing the work, was absolutely everywhere. Obviously, a lot of guys are drawn to security work in the pub and club industry because it gives them free access to a bunch of excitable, rather pretty, dolled up ladies, and they're generally, you know, a few drinks in, they're looking for kind of a good time, maybe not that kind of good time, but they're out, you know, letting their hair down, and guys perceive this to be a opportunistic environment. Now, back in the day, that wasn't really frowned upon, but these days things have kind of changed, and even the fact that guys see that as a fairly opportunistic environment might be not quite so socially acceptable now, because if you've got a bunch of girls in a place that are getting drunk and you're in a position of authority, supposedly looking after them, then the fact that you're just concentrating on looking after them is really the priority, right? You know, that's the responsible and kind thing to be doing. If you've got a secret priority in mind, which is to try and get with one of them and try and take one of them home and seduce them, then that's going to definitely blunt your ability to carry out your job properly. Now, I used to take security work pretty seriously, and I'm not saying I was some kind of angel. I've done plenty of things in my life that are, you know, not the greatest, that I'm not particularly proud of, but I took security work seriously, so I tried not to get involved in that kind of thing too much. I'm also not a huge fan of drunk people, you know, which may surprise you. Working in that sort of sector, that's probably one of the reasons I'm not a fan, was because I worked with them for so long. But the idea of kind of wanting to take a drunken girl home with me isn't high on my agenda of things I would like to do in life. The main thing I want is for that girl to remain safe, not cause any problems, and just not be kind of a problem to me either. So with that said, I witnessed, as I mentioned, a lot of guys were in this business just to get access to these kind of girls, and I saw a ton of that going on. And I'm not suggesting it was like super predatory. They weren't like lurking around waiting for a girl to kind of drop unconscious on the floor and then sweep her off into the dark corner, although I'm sure things like that do happen. More like they would just be putting the chat on these girls, especially if the girls had had like an upsetting experience, they'd had a few drinks, they'd split up with their boyfriend or whatever it was. This was a point at which the security guy would step in like a white knight, and his main focus probably wasn't on, you know, helping that girl. His main focus was generally on if he could sort of step in, act like the good guy, and then kind of cop off with this girl and try and take her out. And some of the girls were quite into this idea because the thought of like a big guy, a muscular guy that's going to protect them and help them, and he stepped up in their hour of need, that's quite a nice thought for a lot of young ladies, and they're looking for, you know, something like that, and they're looking for a relationship. You know, that's what most of the girls were in the club looking for. Of course, the guys knew this and they weren't looking for a relationship, they were just looking for a one night stand. So where I found things quite disingenuous was the like level of lies that would be told to facilitate a one night stand, when I would have a lot more sympathy with the guys if they were simply saying, hey, I'm looking for, you know, just a one-time thing. If you're interested, great. If you're not, okay, let's move along. But they would kind of put all the moves on this girl, you know, tell her how great she was. It might take them a couple of weeks to sort of do all this, the lover boy method type of thing of telling her how fantastic she was, buying her drinks, saying they desperately wanted to go out with her, saying they were single, which I'll get into in a minute. And then, you know, once they finally kind of took this girl out and were able to do something, they would generally not see her again. It was also incredibly common for these guys to video the encounter and then to bring it back in and show the other doorman. I lost count of the amount of times, you know, that a doorman would sort of turn around to me and show me something on his phone. And the last thing I want to be looking at is another guy's genitalia, but that would generally be in the video along with some girl, you know, performing an act on it, whatever. That was incredibly common, and they often used to share these things around amongst each other. So that's really unpleasant as well. You know, I'm sure that a girl who was like partially inebriated doesn't appreciate that kind of thing going on. Now, I suppose if you were arguing on the men's part, there would be a few guys that would say, well, she partook in that, she wanted to do it, she allowed it to be filmed. Yes, but she probably didn't think that that film was going to be shared amongst a bunch of dudes who would all be laughing about it. And secondary to that, she probably thought that this was going to lead, or hoped that this was going to lead into some sort of long-term relationship. And frankly, it didn't. So, you know, that was to me a little bit unpleasant. There was this kind of idea that there was like a competitive element to it. So a lot of the doormen would chalk these encounters up, you know, and share the numbers with each other, share the details about the encounter. So it was almost like a manliness competition, you know, of who could get the most girls or whatever. And that wasn't ever something I was good at. You know, I'm not blessed. I think girls generally like a guy that doesn't look too mean. I always used to look pretty mean. If you've seen any of the old pictures, I'll try and throw one up. But I didn't look like the nicest guy. And I didn't speak much, you know, because I was concentrating on doing my job. So I probably looked like a real meathead. And the girls simply weren't coming up and talking to me. You know, it was as simple as that. I didn't get a lot of female attention. The female attention I used to get was like someone's mother who had been dragged out to the club with them for a hen party would come up and like grab my cheek and say, oh, you're cute, you know, like some sort of drunken 65-year-old or whatever. And I used to get loads and loads of attention from dudes, gay dudes, which again is not something I was looking for, but probably 90% of the offers I got were from gay guys who informed me that I was like part of the bear community, which is apparently very big gay dudes that have lots of body hair. So I didn't really take that as a compliment. You know, I don't really want to be known as a big hairy guy, but there we go. I got lots of offers. If I'd have been born gay, then I would have been a very happy guy. I got crazy offers. Actually, one guy, I was talking to someone the other day about this. I got offered to stay on a yacht in Brighton Marina, and he offered me a Rolex, and it was a considerably valuable watch. But then I was told what the expectation of me would be, which obviously I like the watch, but not quite that much. So I had to let that guy down. But that was one of many offers that I had. So if I had been born gay, I would have been probably quite wealthy, wouldn't have had to work very much. Don't know if I'd have been walking very straight, but you get the picture. I wasn't a popular guy with the girls, I think because I looked very brutal. And the doormen that were incredibly popular with the girls they had a little bit of a feminine beauty about them. So they generally weren't hugely muscular. They were kind of naughty, twinkly-eyed looking boys, and they were kind of pretty guys, you know, so that the girls felt comfortable with them. They looked like they were really safe, and bizarrely, those were exactly the guys that weren't particularly safe, because they were kind of involved in this competitive element of just seeing how many girls they would get. You know, I joined the door scene, the security scene, because I had an interest in security. I found out I was quite good at it at a young age, and I just wanted to kind of do the job And I must admit, I enjoyed the confrontational aspect of it, the excitement, the buzz around that, the sort of fear of the unknown became like a kind of drug. And most of the guys hated that side of it, and they were just interested in chatting up the girls. And that was pretty much the majority of dudes I worked with. So when I finally got my own sort of team together and worked with them alone, I would pick guys that were like me, that were interested in the more professional side of it. And they were getting a buzz out of some of the, the adrenaline filled times, but they weren't kind of pestering girls and hovering around girls. The guys I did work with like that were a pain because you couldn't rely on them. I lost count of the amount of times that there was a kick-off in a nightclub and I would be radioing for people to come through, and there would be like one or two guys that wouldn't appear, and you could guarantee where they were. There was a number of locations that I then, after the incident, would walk around to these locations in a pretty pissed off mood at this point and open a door, and I'd find some dude with his pants around his ankles on top of a girl in like a store cupboard or whatever. And they thought that was funny. I didn't think it was funny because they'd basically put people's lives at risk. If you're doing that kind of job and people are depending on you to have their back, if I'd have been getting knifed on the floor, I wouldn't be laughing about some dude because he wants to have 5 minutes with some random girl in a broom cupboard, so that used to piss me off chronically. So thank God I was able to kind of distance myself from those guys as my career progressed. So most of this was kind of at the beginning when I didn't really have a choice about who I worked with. Now, all of these guys that I knew that were kind of behaving in this way, they had wives at home, they had long-term girlfriends. I didn't meet many doormen that were single. They were probably, I don't know, 5% of the doormen that I met were single, and some of them may have been lying to me even. The vast majority had girlfriends, but a large amount of them were not treating their girlfriends great. I mean, the fact that they were out in clubs looking for other girls is a bad start, but they would moan about their girlfriends and say, oh, she didn't want to have sex with me all the time, I've got a higher sex drive, she's not into it. And just for, that's a pretty common problem in relationships, right? And I've had a bit of that during my time in relationships, and it's worked both ways. I've been in a situation where I was very unhealthy. I was, not in the best sort of physical or mental shape, and I didn't like myself very much at that point in time. I'd really sort of let things slip. And if you don't love yourself, you certainly don't feel like you want to be having sex, even if you're in a long-term relationship. That's kind of the last thing on your mind if you're feeling a bit depressed or a bit flat. So it's no wonder that people go through these stages. So I've been in that situation. I've also been in a situation where a partner has kind of lost interest, and that generally is the common complaint. It was with all these guys, that the lady in the relationship had lost interest or had a very low sex drive, and the guys were moaning about that and using that basically as an excuse as to why they had to go and find other girls to do that with. Now, through sort of age and experience, I've learned, it's not the woman's job in a relationship to service the guy. And a lot of these guys had that attitude of like, well, we're in a long-term relationship and she's like refusing me sex, as if it was some sort of hard-written fact that, some law that she has to like provide him with X amount of sex per week because they're in a long-term relationship. And even worse, if it was marriage, they were so, I've married her and now she's not interested, and they were sort of fuming about this. And that's not the case. People should be having sex because they feel sexy and because they want to have sex with another person, not because it's some kind of debt that they need to pay back. And if you wanted to take the passion and sexual desire out of a relationship, having that expectation is one of the best ways to kill it. If you're a guy who's expecting his wife to perform whenever he suggests it, then you're ruining the sexual relationship just by doing that. If you're a guy that's saying, right, it's Saturday night, we've got to go up to bed and have sex because that's when we do it, another key way of like completely taking the passion out of that relationship. No girl wants to be on like a time schedule and told, you know, every Saturday night we're going to do this. I realise life gets in the way and kids and stuff like that, but you have to find a way to make things passionate again, to make her feel wanted. You know, if you spend the time to actually tell her how beautiful she is, to get her some gifts, you know, surprise her with some things, compliment her, pick her up, take her out somewhere, kiss her randomly without any expectation, you know, kiss her passionately, then she's going to feel a lot more affection and passion towards you. It's not an expectation situation. You're like setting a mood, you know, that's the idea. Like when you were first dating, you wouldn't first, you know, in the first few months of dating someone say, right, it's Saturday night, we have to have sex at 9 o'clock, because they would look at you like you were completely insane. Things happen in a normal, developing way, right? You know, you sort of put the moves on someone, you're passionate, you're hot for them, they feel wanted and desired, they kiss you passionately back, and then things develop from there. Nothing should change from that. Like if you want to have a really good functional sexual relationship with a partner, that's exactly what you should be doing. It doesn't change as you go down the line. And if you think that it's like a debt situation or that you owe each other that sort of sexual relationship, then it will slowly die. That was clearly what was happening with these guys. They're kind of lost interest in their wives. Some of them outright didn't like their wives. You know, it was pretty obvious by the way they spoke about them. They would say some pretty awful things, and that was always kind of strange to me. You know, why would you stay with someone if you really felt that way about them? So these guys were then lying to girls, you know, trying to meet as many girls as possible, saying they were single. I mean, it's always a clue. If the guy's not going to take you back to his house ever, then that clues you up maybe to what's going on. You know, if he insists on going back to the girl's house instead, or he insists on going to some cheap ass hotel, then you can pretty much figure out that something's wrong, right? And a lot of the encounters used to happen in the club itself, in like the toilets or in some kind of grubby cupboard. I remember one club I worked in and I got shown around by a guy who I was going to be running the door team with another dude, but this guy was a sort of head of operations, and he was a bit of a, he seemed like a bit of a cokehead, and he seemed like a bit of a pervert as well. And he took me, he said, I've got a room I need to show you. And he took me around the back of this club and into this kind of weird room. And in there was a bunch of rubbish, a load of old chairs, you know, dusty old chairs and stuff. And then on the floor, there's like this grubby mattress. And he said, this is the room that, you know, we bring the girls to if you want to like have a bit of time with a girl in the club. And then he said, you know, if you need the key, just come and see me. And he had this key that he had around his neck. Like, what kind of person wants to like lay on a disgusting, dirty, used mattress in like a freezing cold, unheated room and try and have a sexual encounter? I mean, for a start, what girl would want to agree to that? But apparently they did. And what guy wants to do that? I certainly didn't. I mean, I'm a germaphobe as it is, so I wouldn't have been anywhere near that mattress. You know, the only thing I'd have done with that is dragged it outside, probably with a pair of rubber gloves on, and then set the thing on fire, because it was vile. And God knows how many people have been laying on this thing. It was obviously riddled, and that was not uncommon, you know, that those kind of places existed in nightclubs, which again would be massively frowned upon now, because that is quite predatory behaviour to kind of have a room set by specifically for the guys in authority over a bunch of inebriated girls to utilise that room for a sexual encounter with one of them. So it wasn't something I was ever interested in. It was something that made me quite uncomfortable, but it was generally accepted by society at the time that was the nature of the club industry. I never in my time saw any doormen spike any girls' drinks, because it was a little bit before that became a big thing. We did start to see that coming in with some girls in the clubs, mainly from customers. I think the doormen, even if they had wanted to do that, would have been maybe too scared of retribution, because there were other doormen, myself included, that would have absolutely kicked the shit out of them and dragged them off to the police station afterwards. So maybe that kind of put a stop to them doing that. But I certainly saw doormen trying to take girls home when they were very, very drunk indeed. And I knew these doormen were not trustworthy guys. They weren't guys that I would have allowed my sister to go off with. They would be telling the girl, don't worry, honey, I'll give you a lift home. You know, I'll look after you. Your friends have all left you and whatever. The girl would be crying, oh, thank you so much. You know, it's really kind of you. At that point, generally, I would go over and say to the guy, actually, I know a couple of her mates. I would try and avoid, wherever possible, taking a girl home on her own, because I don't want an allegation made against me. If I'm in the car on my own with a girl and she's off her head on drugs or drink or whatever it is, she can say basically anything and I could end up in a whole heap of trouble. So I'm going to try and get a girl to come with me. Maybe one of the female bar staff can drive her home. That's a lot safer. Or, you know, at least another person in the car. So we've got sort of a witness situation of what's going on. A huge problem we had to do with sex and clubs was the amount of what I would call date rape situations. So this wasn't commonly doormen, although I was aware of a couple of incidents where that had occurred, not in the clubs I ran, but in the area that I worked in. But there were certainly situations that we dealt with where a girl had been out with a guy, whether she was, you know, first date or they had been going out for a while, and then a situation had occurred where they'd maybe walked down from the club onto the seafront or around the corner in an alley or something. Then they'd come back, the girl's massively upset and said, you know, he's sort of been a bit too much. You know, I tried to stop him and he said no, and it's gone too far. So, of course, in those points we called the police and had the matters dealt with by them. But that is incredibly common, and I would imagine that made up probably the majority of sexual crimes that we were dealing with when I was working the doors. It was people that knew each other. You know, it wasn't like some crazy predatory guy waiting in the shadows and leaping out. That was very, very rare indeed. I never witnessed that happening in clubs, of just a sort of predator that would like try and grab someone and drag them off. Again, it does happen, but it's incredibly rare. But what we saw on a regular basis was people that knew each other, whether that be a male friend and a girl or a boyfriend and girlfriend. And I'm sure it was to do with alcohol, maybe drugs involved as well, that just these guys had already kind of Machiavellian, unpleasant ideas. And then if you give them alcohol and drugs, they're really unable to control themselves, you know, and they would end up pushing things a little too far, and a lot too far in some cases. So that was incredibly unpleasant. On the flip side of that, I also witnessed quite a few times where girls would have had an argument with a boy, were clearly annoyed with him, and would then make allegations to the doorman, hoping that the doorman would beat the guy up, or hoping that the doorman would report him to the police and he would be dragged off for the night and the girl would carry on clubbing. Now, I can't guarantee the way which the situations were, but I do know I saw situations where a girl would run up to me, crying her eyes out, make an allegation. We would like escort the guy out of the club, bring the police, because we kind of had to. The allegation was very serious. But then once the guy's gone from the club, the girl's having the best time of her life, drinking, dancing with her mates, snogging a bunch of other blokes. And I'm like, that doesn't seem like someone who's majorly traumatised to me. I don't know, I'm not an expert in trauma, but, you know, if something horrific had happened to me, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't continue having a party afterwards with my friends and then copping off with a bunch of other people. So I was very suspicious when that kind of thing happened. So guys, you have to be careful as well. You know, this isn't all one-sided. It's not like some patriarchal nightmare where the girls are all these poor defenseless victims and the guys are all predating around them. There was certainly a good percentage of girls that knew exactly how to bend and twist the laws to their own advantage and get people in trouble. I mean, the other things I commonly saw were girls that would be like seeing one or two men at the same time, and they would then set up beef between those guys and sort of say that one of the guys had hit her to the other guy when in fact maybe he hadn't done anything at all, just in hope to get him beaten up because he had upset her in some way, and then you would set these two guys against each other. That went on all the time. That was the majority of the fights we broke up, was probably guys arguing about girls. The girls had sowed some seeds of division with these two guys, and there would be a big kickoff. So that was a real pain. And again, often the girls would kind of be laughing and joking afterwards and going off for a drink, and the guys would be by then injured. They'd probably half beaten each other up or been dragged out by us, whatever it was, and that would have been the night ruined for them, and the girls would just carry on like nothing had happened. So again, be careful. You know, if you start dating a girl and she tells you a bunch of awful stuff about the last guy she was seeing, then for a while just wait on that information, because it's very tempting as a young man to seize that information, try and look like the hero and run up to this guy and grab hold of him and beat him up or whatever. You don't know that girl that well. You have no idea if what she said is true. That poor guy may have done absolutely nothing at all. So just hold your horses and kind of wait and see how serious that relationship gets. Because guess what? If she's lying, the next person that's going to happen to is you. Because when she moves on from you to the next guy, he's going to come and find you and punch you in the face because he's been told you've been super mean to this girl, and it may not be true. Not always. There will be times where, you know, the person has done something horrible to the girl. But if that's the case, you will find out about it as the relationship gets more serious, and you will learn to know if that's someone that you can trust their word or not, you know. And I've certainly witnessed both of those. I've had girlfriends tell me some things that turned out not to be true about other guys, and I've had girlfriends tell me some horrific stuff about their exes that turned out absolutely to be true, and the guys were complete psychopaths. I hope that sheds some light on the industry for you. I don't think it's changed that much. You know, I still know a few people in it. I do know it's got a lot less competent, and the guys are slightly less rugged than they used to be. So they're probably not quite as bad as they were, but I'm sure it still happens. Guys will be guys. So if you're a girl going out for the night, don't assume that all the doormen are there to help and protect you. Some of them will be. Some of them will be there waiting for an opening so they can get their way with you. And be careful of how much you drink. That's a pretty obvious one, but no one seems to heed it. You know, that's probably the main reason that these girls end up in situations that they do, because they simply have too much to drink. Their friends disappear off and things go downhill from there. Watch your drinks, make sure no one's sticking anything in them, and just be aware that if you're going to jump into bed with someone on the first night, it's probably not going to end up in a really fantastic long-term relationship. You know, just by its very nature, the guy is probably not going to respect that girl. He's not looking at her as a prospective long-term partner if he's met her in a nightclub, took her home that night, and they're having sex immediately. So if you really like someone, just wait and have a few dates with them, see how it goes. And from a guy's perspective, you know, I can wait. If I really, really like a girl, I would wait a hell of a long time. You know, I haven't got a problem with that. If I really, really liked a girl, I would take her out on dates. There would be no big pressure to do that. I would just be happy that we're going out, we're having a kiss and holding hands or whatever, and eventually that will come naturally. That's probably how a more successful long-term relationship is born, with a bit of respect shared amongst each other. Thanks for watching. Leave your comments below. If you're an incel and you're just here to like moan at me about that, don't bother. I'll just delete you. I'm fed up with talking with incels, these like red pill dudes or whatever. If you've got something constructive to say, please say it. If you're going to be rude, I will have to delete the comment, because I just haven't got the time to argue anymore. I'm very busy at work and I can't be having like long, massive arguments in the comment section. Thanks a lot. Take care. I'll catch you next time.